This is Mark, your host at A Connector. So let me continue on with the TSMC Morris Chang introduction, background history. Okay, so basically you can see here's Morris's picture. This gives you some more in-depth background. And actually Morris was born in China back in the 1930s. So it says here that he has been the chairman of TSMC since the company was established in 1987 and served as CEO from its founding until June 2005. So during the time of 1985 to 1994, he was president and then chairman of ITRI, which I mentioned last time. That's the Industrial Technology Research Institute in Taiwan. So it's basically a government think tank. It's basically the engine that drove the Taiwan government's backing and finding private sector participants in this whole entry into semiconductors and more advanced technological hardware products. So in Chang's personal background, in his professional career, he served as president and chief operating officer of General Instrument. And before that, he was corporate group and senior vice president for Texas Instruments, as I mentioned last time, but I didn't mention this title. So he basically got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in mechanical engineering from MIT and a PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford University. So very, very much typical immigrant student, just really driven to focus on studies, get into a good school, work really hard, and make things happen. So he's been active in the semiconductor industry for 51 years. Okay, so he was born in China, as I mentioned, and basically from China, he moved directly to the United States at the age of 18. So he was saying that the United States was like paradise when he first got there, politically, economically, and socially. And so keep in mind, he basically lived through what basically resulted in World War II. You know, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they also simultaneously attacked Hong Kong, which is where he was living. His family fled Shanghai, where the Japanese were attacking. So you had the communists fighting the nationalists and the Japanese attacking China. So it was a very tumultuous time. And so for him to end up in America at that time, he thought it was like, you know, paradise on earth, relatively speaking. Okay, so it says that now it talks about how he ended up working for Texas Instruments. So it says, when I went to the US, I went to Harvard entering freshman class in 1949. After a year, I knew that in order to get a good job after I graduated, I should go to a school with more specialized training. So I transferred to MIT. After I got my bachelor's and master's at MIT, I wanted to go on for my PhD, but I failed the qualifying exam, so I sought a job in industry. I had 4 job offers, and just by a very lucky break, I chose Sylvania Semiconductor without really knowing the implications, the ramifications. And I worked for Sylvania Semiconductor for 3 years when I decided, and I was right, as later events proved, that Sylvania wasn't going anywhere in semiconductors. And I knew already that Texas Instruments was rising very fast in Texas. So I joined Texas Instruments after 3 years at Sylvania. I was first just an engineering supervisor at Texas Instruments. By that, I mean I had 2 or 3 engineers reporting to me, and I was in charge of a production line. I was on the fast track at TI. I rose very fast. By 1961, which was 3 years after I joined Texas Instruments, I had already become a manager of a sizable engineering section. It was at that time my boss told me that TI wanted to develop me by offering me an opportunity to go for my PhD. The opportunity was golden because TI would pay full salary while I was a student, and they would pay tuition and other school expenses. And I could even go to 2 or 3 technical conferences in other cities in the US while I was a PhD student. And that was an offer that's hard to refuse. So I took up the offer and went to Stanford for 2.5 years and got my PhD. This time, I passed my qualifying exam with flying colors. I had learned to study hard and study efficiently too. And so after 2.5 years, That took us to the 1964, spring of 64. I finished my PhD thesis and went back to TI to work fully, expecting that I would stay in the engineering area. But after a few months, I got back to TI. The vice president of semiconductor business asked me to head up a very important product department in TI. And of course, that was what I'd always wanted to do, general management. I then became the manager of more than 2,000 people. Remember, back then, production was all onshore, was all in the United States, in Texas. So the 2,000 people, of course, include a large number of production people, but still there were maybe about 200 professional people. It was a big promotion for me for just from being an engineering manager, now becoming a general manager. And after that, I was still on the fast track. I was promoted from less important departments to more important departments. And in 1967, I became the general manager of the most important semiconductor department in TI, which was ICs, integrated circuits. And then a few years later, I was again promoted to be the group vice president of all TI's semiconductor business. And I stayed in that job for 6 years until TI's consumer business. It was new to TI and was not in good shape. They transferred me over to head up the consumer group. I was in that job for another 2.5 years, and the consumer business did not improve. I think that was due to many factors. Then I was transferred to do a staff job. I was still a senior vice president, but effectively, I felt that I had been put out to pasture. Still, I had agonized for at least 2 years as to whether to leave or to stay at TI. But finally, after more than 2 years of agonizing, I decided to leave. So the interviewer asked him, what were some of the highlights of your 25 years at TI? How did you end up as the head of IC operations? So many highlights during my 25 years, a few lowlights at the tail end, but also many highlights, at least in the first 20 years. How did I get on the first fast track job and get promoted successfully pretty fast? Well, I think I did something in each of my jobs. I accomplished something significant in each of my jobs. In fact, my first big accomplishment happened 3 months after I joined TI, and I wrote about it in my book, my autobiography, in the production line that I was in charge of. I increased the yield. The yield was practically zero in the first 3 months I was there, and then one day I kept changing the recipe. Back then, the process, essentially was a recipe. I kept changing the recipe, but I changed the recipe very rationally because at Sylvania I had, by self-study and by experience, become pretty good in transistor technology. And after numerous changes of the process recipe, suddenly one day, 3 months after I joined TI, the yield was up 25 to 30% from zero. Suddenly we were in business, whereas before we were just cranking out rejects. It was a very important production line for Texas Instruments at that time. And I remember that night, I couldn't sleep. I was so excited. I knew that I had accomplished something big because I knew the impact of the high yield. The profit that resulted from that was significant to Texas Instruments. So the interviewer asked, how did you bring up the yield so dramatically? Back then, this was 1958, the industry was still in its infancy, and the equipment that we used was primitive. So it was basically a matter of just having the right temperature, having the right pressure at the various process points, and in order to even guess at what the right temperature, what the right pressure, and what the right dopant, and all those things. In order to even guess at what the right things you should do, you certainly needed a pretty good grounding of device physics. And that was the thing. Device physics was what I became pretty good at Sylvania, that you have to know the basic physics. I was allowed transistor and diffuse transistor at that time. It was alloy transistor and diffuse transistor at that time. My line was a diffuse transistor, so you have to calculate how fast something diffuses into, it was germanium also, by the way, how fast something diffuses into germanium and what the base width is going to be. The base width cannot be too wide. If it's too wide, then you don't get a very strong transistor action. And if you don't get a very high frequency either. But if the base width is very short or very narrow, then you run into shorts. So I knew device physics pretty well by then. And so I tried various recipes. And temperature, of course, was not the only variable. There were other variables as well, such as the impurity of the dopant, et cetera, and the germanium wafer thickness. Heck, all these things that were ancient by today's standards, but back in those days, those skills of how to achieve good yields in transistors, those skills were very valuable skills. Okay, so let's cut ahead a little bit. TI produced most of its device manufacturing equipment in-house for a long time. Can you talk about how and when that turned around and you started buying from outside vendors? So shifting to OEM. It didn't turn around during my days as a semiconductor group head. In fact, it was one thing that I felt we should not have done, but we should not do. And I personally was not in favor of it, or building equipment in-house. I was not the CEO, remember. I was a manager of the semiconductor business. But the company at that time decided that that's what we should do. And we continued for a long time to pull a lot of the resources into that, when we could have put resources in more semiconductor product development. So what opportunities made you leave TI for General Instrument? I left TI without any job offer, and because I felt that essentially I had been put out to pasture at TI, I felt sure that it would still continue to have a job. In fact, even a job with a good title, but my hope of further advancement at TI was gone. Actually, there was only one step further. It was a CEO, and I decided there was no hope of that. And besides, I wasn't doing anything that interested me very much anymore. So that's why I left TI. But immediately after I left, and my resignation was published in the Dallas papers, in the electronics trade papers, and in the Wall Street Journal, immediately after I resigned, I started to get a lot of phone calls. And I pursued 3 or 4 of those opportunities, and one of them happened to be General Instrument. It was to be the president and the COO of General Instrument in New York. And at that time, General Instrument was a sizable company. Not as big as TI, but it was still a sizable company. It was very definitely in the Fortune 500, and I decided this would be a good opportunity for me to manage a sizable company, and I accepted that offer. Okay, so we will take a break here and continue next time. But before I go, I just want to mention one thing, that the stock price of TI, as the most latest posting, is $170, and the market cap is 156 billion. And right now, the stock price for TSMC is $90, so almost half of TI. But the market cap for TSMC is 470 billion to TI's 156 billion. So I think Mr. Chang has been enjoying this for a while. I'm sure it gives him a lot of personal satisfaction to leave such a big and famous company and do some really phenomenal, significant things in his own right. So we'll continue with part 3 next time. So see you then.